Eurasian conjectures, trying to turn what had been collected on a morphological basis into a historical argument.
This really brings me to my second last. It connects, which is in a different sort of way, with history and mythology. You've mentioned that the method of the detective is more pertinent to historical research. This is certainly necessary in ferreting out the evidence. Would you agree that the reading of the evidence in history is more than just putting together the clues? The reading has to explain something of the past. How does a historian find explanations? Can the explanations draw on an imagined past, or do they have to be based on logical, rational connections? This is a matter that is being fiercely discussed in India these days in relation to whether mythology can be taken as history, because the popular history being propagated is more make-believe than history itself. And what you quoted, somebody which was very wonderful about, they write it and then they start to believe in it.
I wouldn't say neither logical nor rational.
Okay.
Because the method I tried to describe, I was not inventing the method. I was trying to describe a method which has been used, in different contexts starting from Neolithic hunters. This was my argument. I don't know whether there is something wrong about no. Okay. So, the idea of, let's say, seeing a footprint and making a guess about an animal which went there is not, let's say, something which is logical, I would say. It's a kind of inference which is based on morphology, which is based on past experience. So it's not logical. Is it rational? But not in the question mark, not in the sense of, let's say, a mathematical demonstration. It's a demonstration of a kind, I would say. But this is something which I argued has been shared by, and then I have to mention, because the triple beginning of or the triple character, three characters, which I put at the beginning of my essay on clues. Giovanni Morelli, the Italian connoisseur, who in late 19th century argued that it's possible to identify original paintings from copies, paintings by, let's say, Renaissance masters and so on the basis not of blatant details, but on the basis of marginal details, like earlobes or nails. So actually, he included in his essays a table with Botticelli nails, Botticini nails, Cosmetura's earlobes. Now, here we come to the second character in my essay, Sigmund Freud, because Freud was fascinated by Morelli's research and books. Actually, Morelli had been trained in Germany. He was from Italy. He wrote in German using a pseudo-Russian pseudonym, Ivan Lermoliev. So Freud came across Morelli's books. Actually, a copy of a book of his most important book, is in Freud's library in London when he had to leave Vienna after the Anschluss. And so Morelli, Freud, and then Sherlock Holmes, a fictional character. So we have, let's say, history and fiction in order to reconstruct this very long trajectory in which we have, let's say, Neolithic hunters, Babylonian diviners, Italian connoisseurs, psychoanalysts, and so on and so forth.
Last one before the audience. And this has to do with conspiracy. The Jews and the Muslims in Europe, 14th century onwards, have been written about as conspirators against European culture. The accusation was made and acted upon, amongst others, by the Catholic Church in some cases, governments, we know that, and others spread through rumors. The notion of a conspiracy by certain groups to undermine society is still prevalent in many societies, sometimes to their considerable detriment. Historians have tried to expose conspiracy by asking who conspires, against whom, why. But what if the historian himself or herself is either unaware of the conspiracy or contributes to keeping it alive? Who exposes the historian?
You know, in a way, my question about conspiracies, was also related to contemporary Italian history. In the early 70s, a bomb was put in Milan and many people were murdered. And immediately, the guilty man was identified, an anarchist. He was not guilty. But having experienced this event, the identification of the responsible for it, and then the long debate about this, I realized that when a conspiracy is set up, a false conspiracy always conceals a real conspiracy, which comes usually from the top, from above. So there is this double level, which was clear enough in 1321 France, when, let's say, a conspiracy against the Christian society was discovered, and identifying the responsible first in lepers, then lepers inspired by Jews, then lepers inspired by Jews, inspired by Muslims in Granada. So, I mean, I was able to argue that when we look at the chronology, at the geography, and at the content of the confessions of people regarded as responsible, usually after torture, they confessed their guilt. But it's possible to argue that, in fact, the secular power launched this fake news. So we have to read between the lines once again. And when we are confronted with conspiracies, well, I also said in my introduction to my book, that actually there are real conspiracies. After all, I mean, I think in a different context I said, but when we looked at the President of the United States, at that moment it was George Bush Sr., and then we looked at the protege of Andropov, Gorbachev, where we can see that secret services which exist play a big role in contemporary politics. So, let's say, we may say that conspiracies are a kind of caricature of political action. How effective is a conspiracy as the conspiracy, because there was a conspiracy, which led in Italy to the murder of Aldo Moro, the president at that time of the, Presidente del Consiglio. So, I mean, the Red Brigades. Were the Red Brigades puppets, as I believe? There were maybe secret services, as a plural, involved, and so on and so forth. So this is still kind of an unsolved mystery. But I think that we are confronted with a conspiracy. Which was the impact of that conspiracy? Which was the impact of that murder? An open question for historians, I would say. It's not self-evident. I would also say that unintended unintended consequences are not the exception, but the rule. Because reality is too complicated to be mastered even by a service or a government.
Thank you, Professor Ginzburg. Great. So, questions? Please keep an eye on that. And
yeah, I think there are questions.
Thank you very much. I have a very pointed question to you by connecting your very first set of comments regarding identity and the kind of psychoanalytic term that you use, identification, as the last set of comments. Now, of course, as a historian, as you are pointing out, that identity is cannot be a very sound analytical category because it changes and all. But coming from a background of politics and political theory, so you have this entire gamut of literature in philosophy as well as in political theory, where without identity, there's nothing it's not possible to explain anything because, and you're rightly pointing out that identity becomes a domain of politics because without that political mobilization is not possible. So how do you then think about whether an interdisciplinary dialogue is possible between a historian and somebody like a philosopher or a political theorist on the issue of identity?
I would start from, first of all, the idea of movement. Secondly, with the idea of plurality. And I think, starting from that, we can see whether a dialogue is possible. But if somebody would ask me, can we speak about Italian identity? I would reject this, but I would look at this as a historical phenomenon, meaning people arguing that there is an Italian identity. But I'm unable to accept this because, for the reasons which I mentioned. But would it be possible to have let's say, a debate about this? I believe so. Saying, for instance, okay, is it certainly, in my view, impossible to find another country in the world in which so many diversity is concentrated in such a small space? This seems to me exceptional. Is this the Italian identity? I would deny this. I would say, okay, starting from this, which has been a construction, starting from the Roman times, then the medieval times, and so on and so forth, how this emerging constraint shaped the diversity. Now, we are confronted with a question, not with an answer, and I think this is a step forward, and we can go on.
So I had a historiographical question which asks of you that you answer it as an actor yourself. I beg your pardon for that. But to what extent do you think the interest of the communist movements worldwide, and especially the more heterodox side of the communist movements, has influenced historiographical production in the first half and in then the second half of the 20th century remains an open question. And to those of us who've been studying historiographical production and the productive tensions in it for years, we seem to be returning again now to the questions that historiography with some sort of socialist and communist influence that had started the debates in the early part of the century. And as we return to that, how do we see the productive force of those debates? In other words, how specifically political were the motivations for some of that history writing?
Well, thank you. I mentioned Gramsci, and Gramsci is the obvious example. Actually, I must mention kind of anecdote. When I first visited India in 1988, it has been recalled here. I immediately, a lecture had been arranged in Delhi at the JNU. And I gave a lecture. I don't remember the topic, but I remember the reaction of the audience. And I had a feeling, there was a very lively conversation. And I had a feeling that it was a common language shared by the audience and myself. And I thought, well, this is Marxism. But then I realized that, in fact, there was Gramsci. So something more specific. And actually, at that moment, I would say that nobody in Italy suspected that there was such a deep and wide reception of Gramsci in India. I remember when I came back to Italy, I sent a letter to the president of the Gramsci Foundation saying, but you know, there is such and such reaction in India. Now, from Delhi, I went to Calcutta. And there was a conference between mostly a group of French historians and Indian historians. So there was a very lively dialogue. I'd been invited to participate in that conference. That was the reason of my trip to India. And I remember that Barun Dey, whom I had never met, asked me in a very distinguished tone a question. You are from Italy. What's the exact meaning of the Italian word subalterno? And I answered, pointing at the military connotations of it. Only much later, I realized that my answer was too literal. There was something deeper about what I should have said. Actually, I wrote an essay on De Martino. I wrote several essays on De Martino, but in one of them, a few years ago, I argued that Gramsci, being in prison and being compelled to circumvent fascist censorship, had used a language which implied not only, let's say, a non-literal reference to what he meant, but also a disassociation from the language of the Third International. So, classi subalterne, subaltern classes, a word which has a deep resonance here, implied the possibility of reception of Gramsci, which was also related to the language he was using. So a tradition, a Marxist tradition, regarding, talking about peasant idiocy, regarding peasants as an intrinsically backward class, was circumvented by Gramsci's language. So it was possible in India to look at Gramsci as an inspiration because, in a way, it was both within and outside that tradition. And you may say the same about hegemony, which was a word which was not obviously literally meant to talk about dictatorship, but provided the possibility of making a distinction between two different kinds of power. So actually, I think that when we look at Gramsci's reception all over the world, and India is a very special and prominent case, we have to take into account the language he was compelled to use and he chose to use. Now, Gramsci is a special case, but I think it points at the richness of that tradition. You said an historiographical question. I would like to say something about myself because when I published my book, The Night by Benandanti, later translated as The Night Battles, I was surprised to read a review. At that time, there were anonymous reviews in TLS, very favorable and generous review. I didn't know who wrote that review. I learned about the author of the review later, much later, when my book was published translated into English, and there was an introduction signed by Eric Hobsbawm. He had written the review. Now, Hobsbawm is an obvious example because, I mean, he was inspired by Gramsci. His book, in my view, his most inspiring book, Primitive Rebels, had been involved a constant dialogue with Gramsci. Later on, much later, I had a kind of debate, public debate from a distance with Eric Hobsbawm, because in a way, he regarded my own later work as too close to the neo-skeptics, which I did not agree with. But in any case, I was immensely grateful to Eric Hobsbawm. It was the first person who recognized my work all over. Now, Hobsbawm is an interesting example in my view, because in my view, his early work was more, let's say, open and more innovative and more, let's say, open to experiments than his later work. But, I mean, we may argue about that. I suspect that you agree on this, but in any case, yeah. Okay, thank you.
You're talking about the microhistory. That means you are greatly analyzing the history in a very micro level. So is there any chance to go for the nanohistory in future?
To go to?
Nanohistory? Because we are going into the nanoscience.
This I don't know. I mean, okay, probably I would start my answer in a very unsatisfactory way, saying that for me, microhistory is based on